Hey, good day, everybody, and welcome to your live event. My name is Eric Wynkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction here at Ruby. And I'm also one of your chef instructors in the courses, along with the rest of my instructional teammates. And today is my office hours, and I want to thank you all for joining me today. This is your chance to ask questions related to food and cooking. And this is my chance to do my best to answer those questions. As we get started, I'd like to mention just a couple of housekeeping items that hopefully will help you navigate the process. The first one is on the right-hand side of your page in the upper corner. You'll see a dialog box that says Add Question Here. And along the way, if you're inspired to ask a question or even add a comment, please type it in, and it'll make its way to me, to the queue that you see on the right-hand side of the page that is already populated with a number of questions. And the other item I want to touch upon here is in that queue of lists, if you look at the individual question rectangle, the dialog box, in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a heart-shaped icon. And if you want that particular question to be answered sooner than later, go ahead and click on that icon. It'll push it up the list. So I'll answer it a little bit sooner. But, as always, fear not. I will answer all the questions today. All right. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and jump on in. Here goes. And so the first item of business, are there any YouTube channels that you recommend for inspiration, recipes, or anything you find useful? I sort of randomly look at YouTube from time to time, depending on what sort of questions come in, or maybe if there's something that particularly tickles me. But I think a go-to for me otherwise is going to be Serious Eats. And Serious Eats is a blog, and Kenji Lopez Alt is one of the prominent team members there. Kenji is an excellent fella, and his approach to cooking is one of testing recipes in an objective sort of way. And so as a result, his discussions in the blog are really to the point. And, in fact, very often when students ask a question via our Ruby Q&A forum, I will refer them to an article from Serious Eats. So that's one that I would mention for you today. So check out Serious Eats and the Food Lab. Kenji Lopez also has a book out as of a handful of years ago called Food Lab, based upon his testings in his discoveries in the kitchen. All right, so check that out. Thank you. And next up from Marina, are there any vegetables and or scraps that should not be used when making stock, and why not? Great question. This is one that I haven't had for a while, so I'm very happy that you asked. There are a couple of broad categories of things that I perhaps wouldn't put in. The first one is probably the most critical, and that is, anything that you wouldn't eat as a standalone item. So in other words, if it's a little bit too far down the path and, has exceeded, its shelf life, so to speak, please don't put those things into the stock pot, because they will only impart off flavors or less than desirable flavors. The other category is one that, at least in the professional kitchen, we avoid, and that is starchy items. And an obvious example would be a russet potato, but other potatoes generally will, as they're simmering, release starch in the form of a very fine powder. Other vegetables do that too, most of them to a lesser extent. But the reason is that it will lead to a cloudy stock. Okay. Now, admittedly, there are times when the clarity of the stock is not important. So, you don't need to worry about some of the starchy items that might cloud the stock. The other thing that comes to mind is I try to stick with items that are relatively flavorful. And I would say that, many items, certainly many things that we think of as aromatic. So in addition to mirepoix, those 3 items, carrots, celery, and onions, other aromatic ingredients. We've got other members of the allium family, so other types of onions, and there's garlic and ginger, and spices can go in depending on what sort of a flavor profile you want to create, depending on what the finished dish might be. Those are all possibilities, and certainly things that I reach for when I make stock. I think, in summary, I would say put only items that you would otherwise eat as standalone items in terms of quality. And then also sticking with a very common desirable outcome, and that is clarity. Try to avoid starchy ingredients. All right, thank you. And next up from Elena. I love the FOK course and am learning so much. I would love to try to make a vegan paella. Do you recommend using plant-based meats? And if so, which ones? Or do you recommend a vegetable only? What are the best vegetables to use? So this is a fun question. And, I'll first answer this question by saying use whatever you prefer, right? Whether it's the meat analogs, right, or vegetables in their natural form. So either way is fine. One thing, when we reach for some of these meat analogs, we sometimes will get denser textures that can more closely mimic some of the meat or seafood items that we might find in paella. So again, that's going to be a personal preference, up to you. Otherwise, a vegetable only paella can be a wonderful creation as well. And, if you're going that route, then, one thing to keep in mind is how you control the texture of the different vegetables, right, in order to have the most enjoyment on the plate. So in other words, you don't want to overcook the vegetables so that you have a unidimensionally soft sort of a texture throughout the entire dish. And, here, I would recommend that you consider cooking some of these vegetables separately and then adding them to the paella at service time, or just prior to service time, to incorporate them and arrange them for presentation as you desire. But if you cook them separately, then you have maximum control over the texture, and you can provide a lot of variety and firmness and chewability and that sort of interaction that we expect from a paella, especially if one grew up with a meat or seafood version of paella. Okay. Now, in terms of what vegetables to use, really anything goes. And again, it's just a matter of you controlling not only the cooking doneness, but also flavor impartation. And so that can be linked to the cooking method that you use, such as roasting or grilling to impart caramelization, which deepens the flavor and introduces stronger notes of umami. Of course, the grill also gives you a chance to introduce smokiness, which can be a very nice aspect, right, of any dish, but I think especially a paella in this case. Fennel bulb works nicely. different types of potatoes. I like to use very often these small, maybe an inch or 2 to 2.5 centimeters in diameter, just a very small potato in its whole form with the skin on, and that helps you maintain some of that beautiful texture as well. But you want to cook that all the way through in order to develop a nice creamy texture. And I recommend a slow, longer cook in order to develop that beautiful texture. Otherwise, if you want to bring in some additional contrast, think about eggplant, think about tomatoes in different types, different sizes, different cuts, again, to give you some different texture variation against something like a potato or a fennel bulb, for example. Again, you can take this in most any direction. Okay, so have fun with that. Thank you. All right, next question. After I make fresh pasta, how long will it be good for if I'm not cooking it right away? And how should it be stored until I cook it? I'll answer this in a couple of ways. The first thing that comes to mind is if you're dealing with a finished pasta, then consider drying it, or at least partially drying it, and that'll help bring some stability to it. Now, if it is a pasta that doesn't contain any eggs, so i.e. it's 100% plant-based, then you can dry it, at room temperature and just, leave the pasta out as needed, and also on a space available basis. If there's eggs in the pasta, then, you might consider refrigerating it after an initial drying period at room temperature, in the refrigerator in order to minimize bacterial growth. And, in terms of how long it'll last, if you fully dry a pasta, you have an idea of how long that lasts, right? It can be a very, very long time. If it's in the refrigerator, and this gets into the other perspective I want to introduce here, if you're working with a very moist, still moist pasta that you want to hold in the refrigerator, or if you're working with dough that might be left over, you want to use it probably within about a day in most cases. Much more than that, and you're going to start to see some black spots develop in the pasta. And it's still edible at that point. It certainly has been in my experience, but visually it becomes detracting, okay? And so do keep that in mind. It's common for dark gray or sort of blackish spots to develop. But otherwise, if it's fully dried, you can hang on to it for a much longer period of time. All right. Try to keep things away from humidity if you want to extend the shelf life, and keep them, in the usual relatively cool place, and away from direct sunlight in terms of longer term storage. All right, thank you. All right, next from Robert. I've heard that tofu should always be cooked, yet I have seen recipes for vegan egg salad or whipping silken tofu as dressing, which uses tofu in its uncooked state. Are there food safety concerns with raw tofu? Thanks in advance. So I'll quickly respond by saying that generally speaking, tofu can be eaten raw. That has certainly been my experience with all styles of tofu. Now, are there food safety concerns? There are food safety concerns with raw tofu as well as cooked tofu. Tofu is high in protein, and it's also high in moisture. And that combination means that it is a very good breeding ground for microorganisms generally. And our biggest concern in the kitchen is spoilage bacteria. So in other words, the normal bacteria in our environment, on our fingers, on our cutting board, in the air, and that we can't get away from. So we try to consume items, within just several days. Often 7 days, is a starting point as a guideline. However, when we talk about beans, right, or legume-based products like tofu, very often the shelf life is a little bit shorter than that. And so you might start taking a look at the tofu very closely if it's been sitting around for 4 or 5 days. It'll start to change in aroma. The surface will start to become a little bit slimy, and the flavor will become bitter, right, as the bacteria consumes the sugar. All right. I always tell my students, when in doubt, put it in your mouth and, see what you got going. But I'll leave that up to you. Okay. I have a tendency to taste everything in small quantities, of course, to see how it's doing. So tofu should be handled minimally so that we are, introducing from our own hands just the minimum of additional bacteria. Keep it stored in water. Change the water daily. That would be the best case. Keep it chilled. Try to keep it out of the refrigerator for minimum stretches of time in order to maximize the shelf life. All right. Thank you. And next up, can you please address the reasons that juicing is not encouraged? It has been a part of our life for the past several years. I think when any of the literature includes a word of caution around juicing. It applies to folks that do it excessively. And, I'm a big fan of, enjoying most anything in moderation. And we want to maintain balance in our lives. And if we have something that's good for us, too much of that good thing often is not a good thing, right? So we want to maintain moderation, maintain balance. And when it comes to juicing, the basic concern is that we're usually introducing a lot of sugar, right, into the body. And again, depending on who you are, right, and what sort of underlying conditions you have or disposition you might have around processing that sugar, it could be a concern. Juicing is, without the fiber that we find in the whole fruit or vegetable, right? So we're missing that important context. And one of the beauties of eating the whole food is that we get the fiber, right, which can help balance, right, our metabolism of the juice and the sugars and our uptake of the sugar. So, again, if it hasn't affected you adversely, then that's great. But I think that's the reason why we often see a bit of a word of caution associated with juicing. Thank you. All right, next from Robert. Nope, I just answered the tofu question. Let me move on here. From Anthony, any suggestions on how to make money with this new knowledge and experience? So, of course, our topic here is cooking, right? Food preparation and sharing our ideas, our enthusiasm, our skills, right, that we've developed throughout the Ruby experience. So how to make money with this? Let me, just maybe touch upon a couple of 3 sort of broad ideas or areas of consideration. And, one would be the consideration of developing a food product, a retail food product. And, whether it's a snack item or a meal that's ready to eat, maybe not an MRE in the military sense, but, an item that could be just heated and enjoyed, or maybe finished at home and enjoyed in the way of a kit. Very often I will see folks at the local farmers market testing out these sorts of ideas. and it's a relatively low risk, low investment way as we rent a booth and some literature, packaging, some of these basics, and introduce the product so we can get some direct feedback from our consuming audience, our testers, even if it's nonverbal, right? The facial expressions often say a lot. So developing a retail product is one way to do that. And providing some sort of catering is another common way to share our knowledge, our skill, our enthusiasm around cooking. And here you want to take a look at what's going on in your locale. Do a Google search. You might reach out to some of the local catering companies, take a look at their menus. If you do reach out to them, ask them some questions and try to maybe engage in an informational interview about what the market potential looks like for additional caterers. Try not to appear like direct competition, of course, because you want them to open up and talk to you. Another thing to consider is teaching, right? In terms of teaching, cooking topics. This is very popular. There are many online platforms that help organize these efforts from many different cooks, in other words, and align you with potential customers. And again, if you do a Google search, you can find some of these resources. But so those are three ideas, right? Developing a retail product, catering, number 2, and then teaching cooking would be number 3. Okay. And again, check out what's going on locally first, and then see where you might fit in, identify the gaps, and otherwise see how your passion, your ideas might fit. All right. Thank you. All right, next up from Jane. I use freezable plastic containers in the freezer for stock, soups, oatmeal, and other dishes from batch cooking. I use plastic storage containers in the refrigerator for flour, nuts, herbs, and some spices. Should I use glass instead? I don't think so, not necessarily. I use both plastic and glass in both the freezer and the refrigerator. I don't have concerns with that. Perhaps some people do, but I'll leave that up to you. Whether you have any reservations or any concerns associated with the plastic. If you do, simply switch to glass. If that brings more assurance to you. All right, thank you. And hello, June. I love flash freezing fresh fruits. That was a tongue twister. And vegetables. Are there any that absolutely need to be blanched first before freezing for safety reasons? Holy cow, that was another tongue twister. So blanching prior to freezing. If you are experiencing discoloration of the product as it goes through a freeze-thaw cycle, it's typically the enzymes that are at work, that are browning the food. And so if you do a blanch, then you neutralize the enzymes and you can maintain some truer color. So that's probably the one area, right, that I think about that would lead me to blanching. Maybe, let me take a bit of a tangent here and talk about blanching just for a minute. In our Ruby lesson on blanching, parboiling, and fully cooking broccoli, for example, we take a very simple approach to comparing, right, these 3 cooking techniques, so that as a student, right, we can understand that how cooking time affects the texture of food. Okay, it's a very simple but very valuable lesson. I'll also add that we use blanching in particular for other reasons. Okay, so I just mentioned that blanching can stop or certainly slow down a browning process by neutralizing enzymes that contribute to browning. Blanching is also used to pull out harsh flavors. Blanching, for example, garlic cloves. This is an old technique that went into a garlic sauce that I've made a number of times in my past, where garlic cloves are blanched briefly, just for several seconds, and then shocked. And then this process is repeated maybe 5 times or so. And you end up pulling out the harshness of the garlic, but maintaining the beautiful flavor of the garlic. And then you proceed with the pureeing and the making of the sauce. And it's a really absolutely wonderful results. But that's an example of how we can start to round out some of the rough edges, or otherwise kind of smooth out some of the harshness that we associate with products. Now, blanching is also used for peeling, right? For peeling peaches or tomatoes, for example. The blanching time varies depending on the degree of ripeness of the fruit and how long it takes for the heat to penetrate and loosen up the skin from the flesh. And then we need to shock long enough to extract all the heat. Okay. And so anyway, those are just a few of the very different reasons why we might choose to blanch. All right. But that's, again, to get back to your question here, that would be the color stabilization reason would be the big one that I would consider. Okay. Thank you. All right. We got Robert again. There are so many cooking techniques available between boiling, steaming, braising, roasting, and more. How do I know which vegetable is best for which method? Or for most part, is this just a matter of taste? I'm going to take your pun, okay, and we'll just keep on moving forward here. I think it's definitely it's about taste. And, for example, if we are using a dry heat method, grilling, sauteing, roasting, we have the chance to develop browning, right? Through caramelization and the Maillard reaction. And this is, all about flavor development and the taste of the food. Whereas moist heat methods, you mentioned steaming and simmering, those do not impart the deep, robust qualities of the dry heat methods, but they do change the flavor, right, in particular ways, right, as an item is cooked, as starches and proteins are transformed, all right? So that's definitely going to be a big consideration. And sometimes it's the look of the products. Maybe you want some dark, rich visual appeal. Hence, we might choose grilling, right, or sauteing. Or sometimes you want a simpler, I'll say cleaner, more natural look to the finished dish. In which case, we might choose a moist heat method. Sometimes it is a consideration that's associated with the tradition around that particular preparation, right? Where traditionally the food is steamed, or traditionally it's roasted. And so we will choose a method along those lines, okay? Sometimes it has to do with the availability of technology. You may not have a grill, so we are then pushed toward roasting or sauteing to develop browning, all right? So those, are a few things that come to mind for me. Now, in terms of, which vegetable might be aligned with certain cooking methods, my quick answer is that probably most any vegetable or fruit, can be aligned with any cooking method. Again, it just depends on what the desired outcome is, okay? And, give it a try. I think part of the cooking experience with any of these methods is also to play around or experiment with the cooking time. A longer cooking time transforms those chemicals and therefore the resulting flavors in different ways than a short cooking time would. Of course, textures change as well, as does the visual appeal due to drying and resulting wrinkling, for example. So pay attention to all those aesthetic characteristics of your food, and think about your desired outcome, right? Again, based upon the style of dinner, the time of year, your audience, and what sort of message that you want to convey via your meal. Thank you. All right, next up. Can you explain connection between umami and MSG? Is there a way to substitute that flavor? Generally speaking, the MSG, the monosodium glutamate, is a source of umami. Umami being this most recent taste, right, that we're focused on here in North America. MSG or monosodium glutamate is in its natural form is present in many different foods. So in lieu of adding, MSG, from a shaker, the way that we can introduce more umami to food is to think about items that naturally contain umami, whether it's sea vegetables like kelp or tomatoes. Cheese, through its aging process, starts to develop some of those qualities. And then, we can also start to bring in some of that fuller satisfaction that comes, with that umami sensation, also through the browning of food. And so try some of these different aspects, these different approaches to food handling, and focus on your degree of satisfaction on the palate, okay, and how the foods are different from each other in these different states, okay, or different phases of cooking. All right, thank you. All right, next up, on the blanching and parboiling task, I had an epic fail. How long does the broccoli stay submerged if blanching, parboiling, and then cooked through? And is this a low boil or high boil? I will also review that unit again. Okay, so as I mentioned a few minutes ago, this is a simple but important exercise. The knowledge outcomes can really influence the way you handle food across the board. Okay, so let me talk about this. Many students ask, how long shall I blanch? How long shall I parboil? How long shall I cook until it's fully done? And there is no set answer. In the assignment, I think we give some guidelines around, blanching for 30 seconds or 60 seconds. And I think that's a good place to start. But it depends on the function of the blanching, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and to some extent, your own personal preferences as well. All right. So there are times when we are blanching green items, this chlorophyll-filled items like broccoli, for only, say, 15 seconds in order to really just lock in the color, to brighten the color, but not to impart cooking per se. And then we'll shock the product, and then that product can be used very often on a crudité platter. And it really maintains the fresh, crisp crunch of that food item, but maximizes the eye appeal Okay, and one of the beauties of enjoying crudité is the freshness of those items, whether they're snap peas or broccoli or carrots or something else. And whether you're dipping it into hummus or a buttermilk dressing or whatever it happens to be, it's that freshness that we're after. And when we put raw product out, there's often a little, I'll say, darkness or dinginess to the color. There's also sometimes just a little hint of vegetal, what I call harshness, associated with the raw version. But if we blanch, we temper that, which allows some of the sweetness to come forth, brightens the colors, yet we still maintain that crisp texture. Okay, and that can be done in as little as 15 or so seconds. But again, just if you don't like it that crisp, maybe you're blanching for a little bit longer. Same thing with parboiling. Let me talk about that step. Parboiling is short for partially boiling, right? Or par cooking, partially cooking. And in restaurant language, what that usually means is that we're going to finish cooking that item at a later time, with a subsequent step. And so that this first step of partial cooking or partially boiling is a means of shortening the finishing time, because in restaurants, right, time is of the essence. We're often, managing multiple pans on the stovetop, and we have to get the dishes composed in a matter of seconds. So, if we can shave off some of the cooking time by partially cooking or partially boiling an item earlier in the day, then it's to our advantage once the customers come in. And so that's some of the context, okay, around the term and the technique of parboiling. Parboiling then is usually going to be a degree of cooking that's a little bit beyond blanching, okay? And again, how far is that? It depends on the item, depends on your desired outcome. If you're partially cooking to, say, the 50% point or maybe the 75% doneness point, then you get to experiment. You get to kind of play around with that in your own kitchen, and then also keeping in mind, of course, your own palate preference, your own desired outcome of that preparation. And then the fully cooked stage, of course, is ready to serve. And in a restaurant, in a professional setting, and certainly if you are cooking for others, if you're catering, these days the style of cooking that we're shooting for is one which maintains some of that al dente quality, some of that firmness to the bite. So that our guests, our diners, our clients have a chance to chew and to interact with the food and to enjoy those flavors in the mouth right before they swallow. And so that degree of fully cooking, right, still maintains some of that firmness. But at home, as you're cooking for yourself and your family, it just depends on what your preference is. Okay, and so blanching, parboiling, and fully cooking are stages of doneness relative to one another, but also relative to your intended application, your intended outcome for that particular product. Hence, specific cooking times are not delineated. Okay, so think about all the stuff that I just mentioned and experiment in your kitchen and dive deeper now, right, into the blanching, parboiling, and fully cooking exercise. Thanks. All right, Robert. My old coffee grinder just clumps the seeds and spices so nothing gets ground. I usually buy them ground and then store them in my freezer because of that. Is there a particular brand that can be recommended, or would a mortar and pestle work best? Let me begin at the tail end of your question by saying that a mortar and pestle can work very well. And it is certainly my preferred go-to. I've got a mortar and pestle tucked in each kitchen corner so that it's never very far away from me. And if you are going to go for a mortar and pestle, I recommend that you, on one hand, consider a mortar and pestle combo that is relatively heavy, so that you can let the weight of what's probably going to be a stone, right? Stones like rocks do the work for you. So you're not necessarily putting in all kinds of muscle through your arms and through your shoulder, which if you're doing harder items or larger quantities of spices, for example, can get a little bit tiring. And then, I also have a small mortar and pestle, probably, this big around, which allows me to do very small quantities very quickly. That's my setup, but, I'll let you decide on what you want to do, of course. In terms of, an electric model, I don't have a particular brand in mind, but what I have found to be convenient, generally speaking, are the grinders that have a removable bowl. And there are a number of brands that offer a model like this. And it gives you the chance to also do some wet grinding. So you can remove that bowl and then rinse it off and then put it back together as needed without the risk of introducing water to the inside of your grinder. But I will also say that I have successfully used, other coffee grinders / spice grinders without a removable bowl successfully. But give those other ideas a try, the mortar and pestle combination, as well as perhaps a grinder with a removable bowl, and then see how you like them. Okay, thank you. All right, next question. What would be a good non-alcoholic substitute for a full-bodied red wine for beefless Bourguignon? Well, a couple of thoughts come to mind. One would be an alcohol-free wine, which still probably contains maybe a little bit less than 1% alcohol. Okay, just to mention that. But otherwise, depending on how much is called for, if it's a small amount, I'd be apt to just skip it because it can be troublesome, I think, to try to replicate some of the flavor that's introduced by a relatively small amount of wine. Now, if it's a larger quantity of wine that the flavor of which is very meaningful, and it could well be the case with a beef bourguignon sort of a preparation, and you want to source a non-alcoholic version, what comes to mind for me is juice from the wine grapes, and you need to have access to a winery very often. Sometimes you can find these products at grocery stores or specialty stores, and these are going to be non-fermented. They tend to be acidic juices, and they can impart flavor, but also keep in mind that they're going to impart some acidity as well. probably a little bit more than the wine would, but not as much as vinegar, for example. And on that note, I don't recommend using vinegar, certainly not in its 100% strength out of the bottle. You can arguably play around a little bit with maybe a diluted version of vinegar. And, maybe it's a red wine vinegar, maybe it's a malt vinegar or something else that gives you some flavor interest, without all of the acidity of the full version of vinegar coming out of a bottle. Okay, so those are a couple, three ideas, including simply omitting the wine if it's especially in a smaller quantity. All right, thank you. And next from Julie. I'm cooking for one. How do I tell if something is freezable? I find I'm throwing out and really don't want to do that. My quick response is that most foods are freezable, at least in my opinion, they are. In other words, I'm going to figure out something to do with that item when it comes out of the freezer. The thing to keep in mind is that foods, especially plant-based foods that are in their relatively whole, right, or intact form, will become more soft or limp as they come out of the freezer and are thawed, because as the water in the cells freezes, right, the water expands, it tears the cells such that when you thaw the product, there's water loss and a softer texture, okay, that results. That's probably where, I find the biggest and noticeable change, right, to an item pre-freezing and post-freezing. Now, otherwise, things that have a lot of moisture in them, like a stew or a soup, they're going to freeze very nicely. And the results or any change is probably subtle enough that you might not even notice it. Okay. Do keep in mind also that as things come out of the freezer, that it's always a good idea to taste test and then to adjust the seasoning or the flavor as needed. So in other words, you might decide to incorporate some fresh herb right at service time after reheating to bring out a hit of freshness. Or you might decide to add a little pinch of spice or a little bit of salt, again, just to adjust some of the flavor or the seasoning. All right. But otherwise, freeze it, label and date it. And there are certainly times and probably examples right now in my freezer of things that I put in there without labeling and dating, thinking that, of course, I spent all day making this. I'm not going to forget what it is, but I have. And so I need to then, figure out how to identify it. And, when it's frozen, there's hardly any aroma that comes off of it. Sometimes, these things all look alike. And so do label and do date, and then try to use those items sooner than later. My recommendation is to use things, within 6 months, and keeping in mind that things continue to degrade in the freezer. They dry out, flavors continue to change, aromas shift. So the shorter you have items in the freezer, the better in terms of quality. All right, thank you. All right, Deborah, hello. I've been asked to add vegan options to 3 menus. I have no idea how to charge each restaurant for my work. It's my first time doing this. I'm a little bit overwhelmed. Can you give me some guidance? Yes, meditation goes a long way to bringing calm. All right. And I say that only tongue in cheek. It's probably good advice, actually. But on to your consulting question. This is a difficult question to answer with any precision. Okay, so let's just talk about it and maybe give you some tools on how to approach your clients to discuss money. Now, it's especially if you're just starting out and you don't have a history to fall back on, right? We need to start to create this anew. And when it comes to restaurants, they're all a little bit different, right? In terms of their revenue generation, their budget for these sorts of projects. And, I find that it is most desirable to just have an open conversation, just a transparent conversation with your client in an attempt to understand their budget. Okay. And on the other hand, you want to keep an eye out on how big this project can be, how much time you might spend on it. Consultants, probably 2/3 of the time, are going to be charging by the hour, but you can also charge by the project, okay? Or maybe even in some other creative way, maybe free meals at the restaurant in the future, for example. But let's talk about cash, all right? As you're starting out, my thought is you're probably going to be charging at the lower end, right, of that pricing spectrum for consultants in general. You're still bringing in some specialty knowledge, and you're asked to do a specialty job, right, which is worth some money, right, to the establishment. Also keep in mind that once you do this work for the restaurant, ideally, they will continue to generate revenue from your work into the future. Okay, and so the work that you've performed, has long-term benefit for the restaurant, and so these factors bring greater value to the work that you do. Where to start? On an hourly basis. Again, I don't know for sure. But very often we're talking about something in the neighborhood of $40 or $50 an hour. But again, if you want to sit down with your client and say, hey, what's your budget? I'm apt to charge you $50 an hour. I estimate, X number of hours, 10 hours, 20 hours, or so on and so forth. Here's what the total might be. Does this fit your budget? If not, let's negotiate something that would fit. Okay. But I think it's nice to know what the other side is working with. Okay. And then, you can come back, right, with a proposal, I think, with a little bit more confidence. At the same time, it's nice to just get that first job, or in this case, 3, so that you can start to build your resume as a consultant and also build your experience, right, as a consultant, which I think is super important in the early stages. All right. So there's some balance there in terms of getting the job, but also, being paid for your time at a level that you feel is going to be fair. All right. So there you go. An imprecise answer, but hopefully gives you some different facets or different ways to approach this very interesting topic. Thank you. All right. Next up, in trying to intensify the flavors of cooked vegetables, how might I use mushroom powder or fermented black beans? What else adds umami? So I think you've got a couple of excellent suggestions here, right, in mushroom powder and fermented black beans, which are, in my experience, really flavorful. And, I find those items do really well when added to stir fries or to moist or lightly moist items, okay? If you are preparing a more dry item, like a roasted item or a grilled item, then you might consider just a very light dusting of mushroom powder, or you might consider making a sauce, right, that utilizes one or the other of these ingredients that you've suggested. But otherwise, just jump on in and add a spoon of black beans, fermented black beans, to your stir fry, and see how you like it, right? Taste along the way, and then start to think about and understand how you might adjust the preparation in order to get a balance that is more amenable to your palate, or think about the accompanying dishes that will bring balance to that dish. Okay, whether it's a bowl of brown rice, or maybe it's millet or couscous, in order to balance some of the more intense flavors that fermented black beans can bring to a dish, for example. And then similarly with mushroom powder, find a place of balance where the mushroom powder isn't so obvious, right? So it's at a slightly lower level of intensity. It will encourage your diners to think about your cooking, to think about their experience, and to engage intellectually with the food and to enjoy it in different ways. Okay. But again, just jump in and try this stuff, and you're going to find, which vegetables these two flavoring powders pair well with, or which ones you don't really care so much for. All right. What else adds umami? Again, umami is this sort of sense of fullness that we look for in foods. Generally, in terms of this sense of satisfaction is concerned, I like to consider caramelization, right, or browning in general. I like to consider adding pickles, and I would suggest that you consider going to an Indian grocery store and looking at their wall of pickles, and then over a period of time sampling those pickles, and then using them in your cooking, not only as a pickle on your plate, which is a wonderful way to enjoy them, but as an ingredient in your cooking. And you're going to discover an awesome new world of flavor components. Okay. Think about layering flavors by introducing different things like miso. Miso pastes come in many different styles. So they offer different facets of saltiness and sweetness, as well as accompanying flavor. You might think about mole paste, right, from your Mexican grocer. And there are different types of mole, and they have different ingredients, different flavors. And these also act as a nice ingredient in cooking. And so those are just a few ideas rather to consider to bring some flavor interest to your cooking. Thank you. And next up, are there any substitutes for nutritional yeast, specifically in vegan cheese recipes? I know it's added the cheesy flavor, but due to dietary allergies, I'm unable to use it. Thank you. So, in terms of nutritional yeast, kind of like the previous question, we're talking about these deeper, fuller, rounded flavors. And so the items that I just mentioned, miso pastes, often work well. Also consider Vegemite, right? Which is a yeast product. If you can tolerate that, then give that a try. If not, then I think miso is a good place to start. And I also like mole, right? Mole pastes as a flavoring agent. Give those two categories a try. Thanks. All right, Anne-Marie. Does plant-based cooking mean more time cooking? Will we also learn about ways to make fast, healthy, and tasty dishes that are kid-friendly? Or will most of the course be focused on cooking gourmet meals? Excellent questions here. I love this. So does plant-based cooking mean more time cooking? Not necessarily, right? Plant-based cooking simply means that we're reaching for just a beautiful ingredients in this vast world of plant-based foods. And it can be as simple, right, or as complex as you'd like. It can be as quick or as long as you'd like. I would like to think that once you move through a Ruby course, that your joy of cooking reaches a level that keeps you in the kitchen longer. And so you're cooking longer because you really love to cook. But otherwise, it doesn't mean that you have to spend more time on your cooking. In terms of learning fast, healthy, tasty dishes that are kid-friendly, let me start with the tail end of your question. Whether an item is kid-friendly or not is totally up to you, okay? And, your kid audience as well, right? Whether they're your own children or children that you're cooking for, it's going to be up to you to understand their palates and to take the time to alter dishes and to introduce new ingredients in ways that will not shock them or scare them away. I think it's also a good idea not to bring attention, right, to these sorts of changes. And this is true for adults as well, many of whom are concerned about plant-based foods for some reason. Just cook nice, tasty food and allow them to enjoy it. If they choose to ask what it is, then explain to them what it is. Another way that I find to make any cooking more kid-friendly is to involve the kids in the food prep and the cooking itself. As children have more buy-in and more understanding of what it is that's in front of them, that is to say that they prepared it themselves, they're going to trust what it is that's on their plate. And so try to draw the kids into that activity, even in the most simple way. Kids that are very, very young can have a role in food prep. Now, in terms of fast, healthy, tasty, let's talk about fast. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, plant-based cooking can be as simple as it needs to be for you. Speed is also based upon your skill development. And this is where I encourage you very strongly to keep on cooking frequently, daily, have a routine so that you are building your skills, and that will make all of this go faster. It still takes some time, right? Like building a skill in anything takes some time, right, before you are proficient and much better at it. But much of that's going to fall on your shoulders, okay? And then the healthy, tasty part, again, is up to you and your understanding of balance, so that we're not relying upon foods that are maybe seemingly easy to make or particularly attractive to your palate, right? Think starchy foods like pastas and potatoes. Bring in an array of ingredients so that we have balance. Maintain whole foods on the plate as much as you can so that we enjoy the full context of that food item, meaning all of the vitamins and minerals, those beautiful phytonutrients that come along with plants, as well as my favorite F word, fiber, right? So important for us. Nature's broom, right? It'll keep us cleaned out from the inside. And so all of those things come with the whole foods that we can enjoy each and every day. And so hopefully that, addresses everything. Maybe I'll reinforce the last part of your question again here. Our courses focus on the foundational cooking methods and food handling techniques that go into preparing anything, whether it's a simple preparation or a more complex preparation, whether it's a snack or whether it's a main meal or main item at the table. So none of it is associated necessarily with gourmet meals, but it can be. But that's totally up to you. All right. Have fun with it. Thank you. All right. Next up from Allison. I finished the course, but I'm still having a hard time with mincing garlic. I've always used the press. Any tricks of the trade that I don't know? Thanks. I really love the course, and the office hours are so much fun. Good job. Thank you very much. I appreciate you joining us today. And, even though you've finished your course, I hope that you'll take the time to join our Ruby live events in our office hours just as frequently as you can, in the future. All right. And so on to your question here. Well, I think in terms of getting better at mincing garlic, first of all, put the press away and pull out that chef's knife and practice, right? The proficiency of the knife is going to come from more time on the knife. And so you have to push yourself to practice. Let me mention, one thing. As we go through the typical cutting, right, with the chef's knife, we've got the guide hand, we've got the blade, and we're using, the best practice, knife blade up against the guide fingers or knuckles. We're breaking down the cloves of garlic just as probably as thinly as we can. We'll come back across in different directions, right, to further mince the garlic. Garlic can be sticky, and so we will need to pull that garlic off the backside of the blade in order to make sure that we get all the pieces minced. Sometimes adding a pinch of salt to the raw garlic, minced pieces can help it become less sticky. So try that technique, if that's bothersome. And, I'll just add another something to try here. And that is, if you want to make a little bit of a paste, I know you didn't ask for this, but I'm going to mention it anyway. Once you mince your garlic, get the knife and just smear the garlic across the cutting board and drag your knife back and forth a few times while you're pressing down on the cutting board. And you might even cut it back and forth if you see some bigger pieces. And then lay that knife down and press up against the cutting board back and forth a few times to try to really smash that garlic, and you can make a paste as well. Okay, that's today's bonus. All right, but otherwise, practice. The basic knife handling technique. Keep those fingertips out of the way, and use salt on the garlic to help it be less sticky. See if that's helpful. Thank you. All right, from Sarah, I really love the course. Thank you. And thank you, Sarah. We appreciate that you're here and also contributing to the office hours today. Are there a few go-to spices or herbs you use to amplify flavors other than the usual alliums and garlic? The quick response is going to depend upon your flavor preference. And if your palate is pretty wide open in terms of global cuisine, then take a look at example recipes from Thai cuisine or Indian cuisine or Mexican cuisine, Japanese cuisine, Korean cuisine, and look at some of the characteristic ingredients that you find in those parts of the world, in those regional cuisines, and then start to introduce those to your cooking more generally. I mean, you can kind of keep it along those paths, right, or those profiles, so that it makes sense, right, in the resulting dish. But otherwise, get to know ingredients in that way. All right. There's a book called The Flavor Bible that will help you approach food in that manner. There are other references as well, and there are certainly websites that will talk about this, but you can just look at probably any example recipes from cookbooks or websites, and you can probably figure it out on your own too. Now, some examples that come through our fridge and our pantry on a regular and frequent basis. Include lemongrass and kaffir lime leaves. There is, in terms of spices, there's mace, which is a cousin to nutmeg. We've got black peppercorns and periodically long pepper, which has the heat of black peppers, but some of the numbing qualities you associate with Szechuan peppercorns. And we also have Szechuan peppercorns. By the way, a blend of Szechuan peppercorns and black pepper at a 1-to-1 ratio ground is a very nice seasoning, kind of an all-purpose seasoning in stir fries. Coriander, spice, coriander seed, as well as cumin. Those often go together in dishes. And let's see, there's cloves. There's cinnamon stick, as well as ground cinnamon. And cardamom, green cardamom very commonly. Black cardamom also. Black cardamom is a larger variety. And it's dried over an open fire, so it gets a smoky flavor. And it's a beautiful way to introduce a deeper smoky, sort of a meaty quality to a stew or a soup or a curry, for example, while still staying with a plant-based preparation. Okay. So those are a few. I guess I would also have to add in turmeric. And if you're using turmeric, be sure to use black pepper because the black pepper enhances the bioavailability of the turmeric so that you enjoy the health benefits of the turmeric. All right. And, I'll also give a plug for the health benefits more generally of all of these, fresh herbs and the spices that I've mentioned. They all have an array of phytonutrients that does your body good. In fact, you can probably dig into our live event archives and you can find an old talk on spices, and if you're interested in that topic. Okay, but those are a few examples to get you started. Thank you. And next from Betty, I would like to hear your tips and tricks on how to cook kale. When I cook kale, it's always tough. One thing that I like to do with kale is to cut it into smaller pieces, okay? And then, that will shorten the strands of fiber, which right there, makes it a little bit easier to chew and enjoy. There are times when I put them into a soup or a stew that I will chiffonade the kale. And if you recall, chiffonade, right, is a knife cut. It's a long, ribbony cut that we apply to leafy items. And so I'll chiffonade the kale, which again shortens the fibers, which makes it a little bit easier and more enjoyable to chew. And then also, if you let the kale simmer a little bit in a wet preparation, a stew, right, or a soup, it'll start to tenderize a little bit. Otherwise, I also like to occasionally, use the massaging technique that we introduce in our Ruby courses. In one of our lessons that is really about understanding how salt and acid and fat will affect foods. We use kale as the example in that particular assignment, and it breaks down, it softens depending on how much massaging you apply to it, and just how vigorous your handling is. You have some control there. Okay. And so those are a couple of suggestions. Give those a try and see how you like the kale in both a raw state that's been massaged, as well as a cooked state, right, where it's been cut into some smaller pieces via a chiffonade in order to make it more tender. And then I see that Patrick has posted a link to the archived live event on spices. So check that out. Thank you. And Tamiko is asking, when cutting fruits and veggies for the dicing homework, how do you not get the rounded edges, for instance, with carrots, zucchini, etc.? Aha. So, when submitting the assignment itself, if you want to pull out, right, or remove those rounded edges, you're welcome to do that. And the result is going to be a much sharper, sort of a crisper, looking sampling of product. I will also say that, when it comes to scoring your work, to grading the knife cut or knife skills exercises, I don't, and the members of my team don't look at the natural curvature of the fruit or vegetables. We don't count that against you. Okay, we're looking only at your knife cuts and how even they are, how consistent they are, how true they are to the dimensions of that specific knife cut, right? A medium dice being 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, for example. Okay. Now, in our day-to-day cooking, it's common, right, to keep the rounded edges of the produce items in with the foods, and then we just proceed with cooking because it's kind of a hassle to remove those items and then to hold on to them and then to find another outlet to use them, because we certainly don't want to throw them away. Now, if you happen to be working in a high-end restaurant where the chef wants you to serve only, the perfect knife cuts, then we need to pull out those rounded edges and then really practice our knife cuts in order to present just those tip-top samples in the dishes that we present to the guests. All right, so those are a few things that come to mind that will put into context this broader exercise of developing knife skills. Thank you. Okay, and next up, is there any use for gumbo filet in vegetable cooking? Gumbo filet is a thickener, and so if you're not making gumbo, but you want to add some add some body to the soup or the stew that you're making, go ahead and add some gumbo filet and see how you like it, right? Always start with a little bit and then make adjustments as you go on. Okay, thank you. And next up, any recommendations on not too expensive cutting boards, bamboo, wood, and what kind, or plastic, best way to care for the cutting boards? My take on cutting boards is basically to avoid the very hard materials. And I have seen cutting boards made of glass and stainless steel. And those are not my favorites. But I use plastic as well as some natural fiber, wood and bamboo. Bamboo boards tend to be a little bit harder than many of the wood varieties out there, but I'll leave that up to you on, whether you want to use bamboo or not. I don't personally have a problem with it, but some people prefer to avoid it because they think that it's a relatively hard surface and they don't want to cut on it. In terms of wood, there are many varieties out there, and hinoki is a Japanese cypress that is relatively soft, and you might give that a try. There are hinoki boards available online. In terms of plastic, here too, on one hand, you can, I would say, take a look at a local restaurant supply store, and any of those plastic varieties are generally suitable, quite fine for our knife work at home. If you want to look online, there are some higher end professional plastic boards that are made from plastic or a very, very dense rubber that provide a firm surface, but a relatively soft cutting surface in order to maintain the longevity of your cutting edge. And so you can take a look at some of those different choices that we have today. Thank you. Now, and in terms of caring for them, yes, plastic, just a quick scrub. I tend to let things air dry. When it comes to natural fibers, and I guess this is true of my plastic boards as well, I like to clean my boards immediately after I use them. I'm not one to leave a cutting board sitting around until after dinner. I clean it up and then set it off to the side to air dry. And if there is a stubborn aroma, I might use a little bit of soap and scrub it, but otherwise it's usually just soap and water. Not soap, a scrubby and water and some elbow grease. And I'll let it air dry at that point. That's usually fine with me. All right. Thank you. All right. Next up, for the graded activities, are you allowed to swap out some of the ingredients or add your own slant? Good question. So, my general response here is two-pronged. Number one, if you must make a substitute, due to an allergy, for example, or maybe you can't find an ingredient, for example, then that's fine. On the other hand, if you do make a change to a preparation, to an assignment dish, it must still meet the outcomes, the learning outcomes of that particular assignment. Okay. And I'll give you an example. We have a clear soup assignment that features cabbage soup. And I will sometimes get students that say, I don't like cabbage. And I have submitted this other soup that I like. And they end up submitting a pureed bean soup, let's say. Okay. Now, at that point, the soup is no longer a clear soup, which was part of the learning outcome of that assignment. It's now shifted to a different category of soup. So that particular submission or example would earn probably 0 points, maybe a couple points if I'm in a good mood for the effort. So keep that in mind. If you're unsure about possible changes, to the learning outcome, then just shoot us a question, via the Q&A forum. That's often a quick way to do that, and we can respond to you and address your specific situation. The more detailed your question and your scenario, the better. All right, thank you. All right, next up. Thank you for taking this time with us. My pleasure. I look forward to these events every couple of weeks or so. I'm glad you're here. Any comments on convection oven usage? I think convection ovens are wonderful. they circulate a lot of hot air, which facilitates browning, and also usually hastens the cooking time. So you can shorten the cooking time. You are often decreasing the oven temperature setting because it's a hotter environment. And so overall, I think a convection setting can be very good, right? Now, you also want to be aware of this additional drying effect. And there are times when you may not want the air blowing around or that added convection. If you've got particularly fragile things, maybe you're baking meringues, the fan could blow the meringue so they're all kind of sort of sideways. And so you might want to turn the fan off. Also keep in mind that if you're especially baking and you're using parchment paper, the fan can blow the edge of the parchment paper up so that it sticks to the food item that's next to it. And so you might want to position things at the edge of the parchment paper so it doesn't blow up. Or you might want to turn the fan off. But otherwise, a convection oven can be a wonderful piece of equipment to work with. Thank you. When's the best time to season a dish in the cooking process? Asks Linda. My general approach to seasoning is all through the process. But there's also some personal preference that comes to mind, where you might want to just season it toward the end. And it might even depend on the particular food item. Okay. For example, if I'm cooking potatoes whole, depends on how I cook them. If I'm putting them in water, I might salt the water. I may not. But once I cut them open and then use them in a preparation, then I'm certain to salt them or season them at that point. So seasoning usually encompasses both salt and acid. All right. So, the addition of a squeeze of lemon juice or a splash of vinegar would be a part of that seasoning step as well. Okay. And so, start by seasoning throughout the process and then just pay attention to the end result and see how you like it. And then make adjustments from there. There's not a hard and fast rule, okay, as to whether it's done just at the end or throughout the process or at some other time, okay? But cook, with a lot of engagement, and then you decide what works best for you. Thank you. All right, hello, Gloria. This class is great. Excellent. I'm glad you're enjoying your course. I'm gluten-free and trying to be a whole food plant-based. Do you have any recommendations on trying to stay away from over-processed items without having to make my own breads and pastas? Well, I think looking at these two categories of foods, breads and pastas, definitely therefore, reach for whole grain or whole food versions, right? Some of them have legumes, some of them have grains, so that you're getting the context of the food, right? All the skins and stuff, right? So you have the fiber and all that beauty that comes along with plants, which means read the ingredient labels, okay? And if you're uncertain about an ingredient, then you will need to look it up and start to study, right, the ingredients that go into different foods, especially prepared foods from the store. It's a process, Okay, and it's not always easy to figure out what these ingredients are and how they're made, how they're processed. So have patience with the process. Um, Now, I will also put a plug in for cooking, right? For actually making your own breads and pastas. And, as you develop the know-how and the skill around bread making, for example, or pasta making, it's pretty pain-free. Sure, it takes a little bit longer than pulling out the pack of pasta from the pantry. But it doesn't take a whole lot longer than that. And I think the rewards are tremendous. And you know exactly what's going into that particular batch of dough, whether it's for the bread or for the pasta. Okay. And so practice makes better. Practice makes you more proficient. And it also makes your cooking go faster. And so do keep in mind those couple of things. Study, on one hand, to understand the ingredients that go into your processed foods, and then to prepare more breads and pastas on your own. Thank you. All right, next up, a lot of recipes use oat flour. I'm trying to avoid oats and wheat. So what's the best substitute and the healthiest substitute? Flour, perhaps quinoa flour? Well, I would say certainly check out quinoa flour. Right? If that's, one that, you feel comfortable with, just, bring that in place of oat flour, and, see how you like the results. Oat flour, I guess it depends on what you're doing, but, oat flour can bring in a nice sort of stickiness, and it is a binder in a nice way in different preparations. But flours, generally speaking, are also sticky and act as a nice binder. So whether it's quinoa flour or chickpea flour, right, or something else, just check it out. You might visit Bob's Red Mill and look at some samples and some examples. And just play with them, experiment with them, see what flavors you like, and then what kind of textures are appealing to your palate as well. All right, thank you. Next up is wine used in plant-based cooking? If so, would you suggest red or white? Yes, you bet. I mean, wines can certainly be used in plant-based cooking, totally up to you or up to the recipe or preparation. Would I suggest red or white? I think it depends on what's being prepared. Very often red wine is called for in a dish that has some more robust flavors, maybe a darker color to it due to caramelization, for example. Whereas white wine is called for in lighter colored preparations, such as a white sauce. All right. And, if you're looking for wine, red wines, there are many to choose from, but some common varietals that are used in cooking on the red side include Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, occasionally Pinot Noir, and especially some of these, newer styles that are a little bit maybe darker in heavier in flavor. On the white side, Chardonnay is a long time sort of go-to example of a white cooking wine, as well as Sauvignon Blanc. And, if you have other preferences, you can try some of those. Depending on what you're making, you might also consider sake, and, even some varieties of vermouth are very nice. All right, thank you. All right, next up, I am a blogger and was hired by a brand to create a dish using their blueberry lavender jam. My mind immediately went to pork tenderloin, but I'm curious what other ideas you have. Wow, blueberry lavender jam sounds wonderful. in terms of preparations that could be paired with or incorporate a blueberry lavender jam, well, you mentioned pork, so let's start out with meats. Okay, blueberry and lavender, especially that combination, are they're darker, heavier, and more robust in flavor. So I'm thinking about heavier flavors. And so in the meat category, there's certainly beef, there's lamb. I like pork butt, right? And so you get into a roast or a braised dish, using braised, braised or stewed, but you can also at service time serve it in a more dry format by straining out some of the gravy. You can incorporate some of the jam into the gravy, also developing browning, deeper flavors through caramelization. So we have roasting and grilling, depending on the cut. That can go very nicely with the deeper flavors of a blueberry lavender combination. On the, I guess another idea here, I probably wouldn't reach for chicken breast, but chicken thigh could work. That's a heavier, fattier, dark meat, especially if we're bringing some nice browning and deeper flavor notes through the chosen cooking method. On the plant-based side, here, generally speaking, we have lighter flavors. So I think I would reach for a dry heat cooking method. So roasting, sauteing, grilling come to mind in order to develop some of the deeper, heavier notes that come from the browning that will pair, I think, a little bit easier with these more robust flavors from the blueberry and lavender. So, what could they be? A sweet potato preparation. I'm even apt to combine different types of sweet potatoes. Maybe an ube, which is a variety of purple sweet potato. There's an Okinawan sweet potato that once cooked has an almost black look to it. It's so dark purple. There are, orange fleshed and creamy fleshed sweet potatoes as well. And those can be combined in a dish with onions and garlic and, spices as well, with the introduction of some of the blueberry lavender jam. Either folded in very lightly or perhaps, certainly garnished on the side, but a garnish isn't always so interesting. To fold that in, I think would be more interesting. And it can go, it's got a savory and a sweet profile, so it can go with a lot of different items, as a side dish. A nice, deeply caramelized cauliflower steak or a cauliflower preparation of some sort could handle, I think, some blueberry lavender jam. So those are some ideas that come to mind. All right. But think about spices as well. Cloves, cinnamon, cardamom, black cardamom. Those are all flavors that will create a bridge between the jam and whatever food that you might be playing with. Okay, but introduce some caramelization as well. All right, thank you. All right, from Stella. What do I need besides lots of interest and burning desire to start a business as a plant-based coach? I'd love to help people turn their lives around by opening the door to better health. I would say that you need a business plan. All right, that is always top of mind for me when someone wants to start a business. In order to understand the market and the market potential, and ways of marketing, whether it's through social media or through some other channels. And then to understand just what sort of a product you will sell. In this case, the product, right, is a service in terms of coaching. But is there something else, right? Might you also include some cooking lessons, right, as part of your coaching sessions? Will you also, include shopping outings, right, to the grocery store, to the farmer's market, to show somebody how to select food items? Depending on your clientele, right, you might consider choosing different types of shopping venues, depending on price point or other complexities. And so a business plan will sort of force you to think about all of these various areas, right, of a new business. All right. So in addition to your burning desire. Thank you. All right. Next up, how do I wash and dry cilantro so that it's not wilty when I chop it? I like to dry it off as much as I can. And so I will use a salad spinner. And, the OXO brand, they have a nice salad spinner for home use. Nice size, nice design, very easy to use. That can work very, very well. If you're using a salad spinner, I recommend 2 stages. One, just get your product, whatever it is, cilantro or otherwise, in the salad spinner, give it a good spin, bring it to a stop, fluff it up, and then give it another spin. And that will usually release some water that was sort of tucked in and hiding behind leaves and was unable to escape during the first round of spinning. Otherwise, you can, I like to also just kind of shake it out and kind of slap it against a dry towel, so to speak, in order to pull out the water. It's kind of like a salad spinner, but a manual version. So give that a try. Thank you. All right, next up, I bought my Global chef knife a year ago, and I'm left-handed. I was told it would work. I tried using my whetstone and now have a very dull knife, and I'm thinking that I actually have a right-handed knife as it is a single bevel. Help. Okay. So well, if you are left-handed, you can certainly use a double beveled knife. Okay, that's fine. If you want to use a single beveled blade, of course, the bevel needs to be on the correct side. And so, it needs to be on the side of the blade away from the food that you're cutting, right? So if this is the food I'm cutting and this is my knife, then my bevel is going to be on this side of the blade. Okay, so if that was a slicing item, it falls away from the blade. Okay, so first of all, just check and see what you have. If you have a single bevel on your blade and it's on the incorrect side, the easiest thing is to return that knife to a double beveled blade. So you have, an even bevel on each side. Otherwise, you need to grind down the blade a lot. And I'll leave that up to you, but do understand you're going to lose a lot of metal. Okay. So then you're faced with buying another knife that has the bevel on the correct side for a left-hander, and then maintaining that. Okay, so yeah, think about those approaches. Thank you. All right, next up, hello. It has been an adventure converting from an avowed foodie to whole food, plant-based, and no salt, oil, sugar. All right, due to my husband's quadruple bypass. Most disappointing is that I can't seem to create elegant dishes that have delicate and flavorful sauces without adding a ton of chilies. Okay, interesting. Any suggestions? Aha. I would say explore regional cuisines. Okay, and try to take a deep dive, or relatively speaking, a deep dive into each one, spending some time in that region and getting to know the flavor profiles and the different ingredients, how they're used, in sauces or otherwise. And I think as you gain more control, right, over those collections, those sets of ingredients and accompanying cooking methods and techniques, that you're going to find satisfactory dishes emerge, some samples from each of those regions. Okay, and many parts of the world use chilies, and so you might quickly find some dishes that you enjoy, but many parts of the world use few chilies or no chilies, and so it's going to push you to discover a new way of enjoying foods, and also it's going to expand your cooking in a very interesting way. So, without habitually reaching for chilies, and I know what that means because I love chilies myself. But I think as you dive into regional cuisine, you might find your answer there. Thank you. All right, next up. Do you have experience working with FOK recipes for an income-limited audience, such as folks who are getting lots of groceries from a food pantry? My farm donates a lot of produce to food pantries, and I'd like to be able to promote and share these recipes. Yes, I mean, to some extent. And, I think that, as we look at a recipe, right, in this case that you would like to be perhaps accompanied, right, with your farm donations, take a look at some FOK recipes and think about how to simplify them. Okay, both from an ingredient count perspective, and also from an ingredient expense perspective, right? So, for example, in some of our recipes, when we suggest sea salt or fleur de sel, it doesn't have to be, right? Salt is kind of salt. There are some differences, but if we're talking about salting food, iodized salt, right? The least expensive stuff from the grocery store is quite fine. If we're talking about potatoes, they don't have to be fingerlings. They don't have to be Yukon Golds. They can be russets, right? Or whatever is going to be available. All right, from the garden, from the farm at the lowest price, but also express that way in the recipe. So, in other words, our recipes, can be rewritten. They're going to probably require some testing on your part, just to be sure, right, that any changes that you make in simplifying a recipe will indeed result in what you're envisioning. Okay. But then ideally, I think that if you can present, this is probably what you're talking about here, right? But ideally, if you can then present a recipe card, right, or a recipe sheet to the food pantry, right, to be given out with your produce as well as the other foods that are given out, that would be ideal. And then the recipient will be on their way, right, with the most user-friendly recipe example. Yeah, I mean, give it a try. And then if you have specific questions, reach out to us at support@ruby.com. And if you have questions, the more specifically they're worded, the more helpful it'll be. Thank you. All right, next up, any suggestions for cooking lobster and porcini mushrooms to gain the most flavor and not relying on a sauce? Let's see here. Dry heat in a pan. Saute. Bring in some other moist ingredients. If you like garlic and onions, for example, bring in some of these things. You might even combine them with the sweating technique, right, to draw out some flavor, to soften textures. And then you can proceed, with combining those with some other things like potatoes, for example, or other root vegetables, and then see how you like some of those combinations. Okay. Thank you. All right. So Ellen asks, I'm also left-handed. Any tips for choosing a chef's knife for us southpaws? I think that, first of all, most knives are double beveled, which means they are friendly for anybody. The big question is going to be on the design of the handle, right? Many handles are molded or contoured to fit a right-hander. So you want to find a knife that has just a more simple handle that is uniform in both directions. That's going to be step one. Now, step two would be to look around for one that's got maybe a single bevel, right? As we talked about a few minutes ago, that's going to be more tailored to a southpaw. And there are a number of options I know on the market from different companies, but you do need to kind of look around. And because they are fewer in number, expect the price tag to be a little bit higher. Okay. But one place to start would be with the Victorinox brand. And that's the Swiss Army knife people. And, they make a relatively inexpensive line of knives with a stamped steel blade, a molded, hard rubber handle that is relatively comfortable and a great value. They are easily maintained, and you can sharpen them however you like in terms of a double bevel or even some sort of an uneven bevel that fits your left-handedness better. Consumer Reports magazine a number of years ago labeled them their best buy, and I would agree with them with that. So give that a try. Thank you. Okay, and next up from Marco. How many days can you safely dry a whole chicken in the fridge? Okay, so poultry is going to last a couple-ish days. You might be able to double that, especially if you hold it on ice and keep it very, very cold. Bacteria tends to multiply rapidly on chicken, and hence they get a little bit slimy and stinky pretty quickly, and it can get that way within a couple of days. And so, my first tip would be to just limit the drying time to a couple of days. And certainly if you're drying out the chicken, then you don't want to have to go through the steps of washing it off again because it got a little slimy under the arms. But so yeah, try to limit it to 24 to 48 hours. Keep an eye on it. Just kind of gauge what it's doing right in the fridge. That's going to be the safest bet. All right. Thank you. All right. Next up, hello. I really like the contents of the course and the online office hours. I'm very happy to hear that you're enjoying that. Thank you very much for the feedback. I want to ask about the most difficult part of the course. To be a good cook, which sections do we need to be handy on? I don't know that there's any one, unit or topic area that's the most difficult. It all depends on your comfort level, your familiarity with cooking as you come into our courses, as well as your interest in certain aspects of cooking. All right. My recommendation is just to approach each unit with gusto and, move through the practice recipes, understand the techniques, and give it a try, right, in terms of developing some understanding of how to do that method, how to do that technique, and how to have control over the food in that particular instance. That's our goal, after all, is to be in charge of the food, in charge of the recipe that we might be using as a guide. Okay, so that the recipe is not taking control of us, for example. All right. And then, in no time, in a little bit of time, you'll be very confident in these different areas of cooking, and you'll be very pleased with yourself. All right. Thank you. Of course, as you have questions along the way, please reach out to us either through the Q&A function in the course on the task page or through the support at ruby.com. All right. Thank you. All right. And Michelle says, I'm with a college and I want to know what types of food are better in iron. I think spinach is good in iron. I think there are some cuts of meat, like organ meats, that are high in iron. Legumes, I think, are relatively high in iron. That's one place to start. Okay, you can always do a quick search as well if you wanted to expand some of those food categories and suggestions. Thank you. All right, good day. I'm loving the course and these sessions. Thank you. You're very welcome. I love to cook. I do all the cooking in the house, but I feel like I lost passion. How do I get it back? Well, so yeah, this is a fair question. I think for me anyway, one way that I like to bring a spark of interest, in my routine is to try something new, is to learn something new, is to explore global cuisine, the flavors, as well as the food handling techniques that go along with that are often new to me. Or, if I have dabbled in them at some point in the past, maybe it's nice to revisit them. And, I think that that's a nice place to start, especially if your palate and your audience is open to the beautiful flavors that we find around the world. Take a look at some new ingredients, maybe just one, maybe just two ingredients, and start to learn how to use it in different preparations. Or you might take a look at a particular preparation and learn how to make it in different styles, different interpretations. Start to learn how spices are used in a Mexican context, right, versus some other global context. And in that way, you can learn about the culture and the history of that part of the world as well, which for me is always a hook as well. I like to learn about those aspects of the bigger package of cuisine, right, about the people that come along with the food. All right, I hope that helps you. Thank you. All right, next up, before roasting vegetables, should they be at room temp or can you go from refrigerator to oven? Loving the course. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome, James. I'm so happy to hear that you're enjoying the experience. And thank you for joining us today. Regarding veggies, there's certainly going to be less temperature distance to travel, so to speak, if an item is brought up to room temperature before it goes into the oven. But if you're pinched for time, you can certainly go from fridge to oven. Keep in mind it's going to cool down the oven. It will influence cooking of that item as well as, heat is penetrating that item more slowly over a longer cooking time as the item itself is warming up. And so, the end product might be a little bit different. Okay, it could be more dry. It could take a little bit longer to develop a browning if that's what you're shooting for. So I think this calls for experimentation. Try 2 batches of the same thing, one straight from the fridge, one after having been at room temp for an hour or 2, and then compare the results. And you're going to have the best insight and understanding of that particular ingredient at that time, and then go on to applying that same sense of curiosity to other food items. All right, thank you. All right, next up, if you want to make a vegetable consomme from a stock, what do you use as a raft? Okay, so a consomme for our general audience, right, is it's a soup that is based on stock, and it's clarified, and it's also fortified in flavor by the ingredients that go into the raft. And traditionally, a consomme is going to be it certainly can be a vegetable soup, but this raft is not plant-based. It's got some meat, it's got some egg whites, and that does double duty. It adds flavor, thereby fortifying the flavor of the soup, as well as clarifies the soup by grabbing onto things that are in suspension. Okay, so to replicate all of this with plant-based ingredients, can be fun. Okay, I'm thinking about this. So I think one thing to do, first of all, in terms of the fortifying step, is to reduce the stock. Okay, to strengthen the flavor, to fortify the flavor, to concentrate all that goodness. Okay, and then we'll have to take this in 2 different steps. The clarifying step, what comes to mind for me is agar, right, or agar. And there are a couple of approaches here. I mean, one is to bring the item up to a simmer, add agar powder, agar flakes. Follow the directions on the package that you're using in terms of ratio of agar to liquid. You got to bring it up to a simmer or a boil in order to hydrate the agar. Excuse me. And then let it cool and set. And then one method is to freeze it. And then another method is to skip the freezing step. Let me go down the freezing step here. You freeze it, and then you pull it out of the freezer and then put it in, ideally cheesecloth, and then just let it melt. And it'll start to weep and release liquid. And what's captured and discarded is stuff that was in suspension. And so what results is a clear liquid, except the yield is not so great. A similar process, but one that skips the freezing, has you, activate the agar, chill it, to let it set, and then to just take that, break it up, with a whisk, for example, and then to put that through cheesecloth lined strainer, and then let that the liquid release, and the agar will have grabbed on to particulate in suspension, and it will release a more clear liquid. Okay, and the yield is much higher, and so it becomes a two-step process versus the traditional raft that is used. Okay, so give that a try. Thank you. All right, next up, we moved from Dallas to California last month, and our kitchen is under renovation. I am unable to take pictures. Does it matter if I don't send the picture? Thanks for understanding. So, Usha, I think you're referring to our assignments, right? Our photo upload assignments, which require the photos along with your written description, okay? As they say, a photo is worth 1,000 words, and it's amazing how much we can tell about your food handling from your photos. And so without the photos, a big part of our ability to understand your food and to critique your food is taken away from us as instructors. So your photos are required. Otherwise, we will simply ask you to resubmit the assignment. So what I suggest is that you move through the course otherwise and study the text and the videos. You can even do quizzes, do other activities that are built into the course. And then, when your kitchen renovation is complete, you can come back and move through the cooking exercises. And then at that point, you can take the photographs and then send in your completed assignments. All right. Thank you for your understanding. And looks like this might be our last question of the day from Vanessa. For wok cooking, can you blanch, say, broccoli and green beans, then refrigerate a day or two for cooking in a wok? I have an 87-year-old mother who has problems with the harder veggies when we wok cook. Yes. So I think, what you're talking about, Vanessa, is a par cooking step, right? In order to soften them initially, and then you'll finish the cooking process, in that next day or two, right? So you are practicing batch cooking by preparing some components of future dishes. And you could well be locking in the color for some beautiful green vegetables. And, you're also shortening the cooking process on the day of service by partially cooking on that earlier day, right? So there's a number of things going on at the same time here. So yes, I think what you're suggesting is perfect for stir fry work, any sort of a work in a wok. A wok is quite versatile, right? We think about stir frying, but you can do anything in a wok, right? Bake, smoke, deep fry, in addition to stir fry and other things. But yes, what you're suggesting is perfect. All right. And I want to make sure I answered your question. And I think I did. Thank you very much, Vanessa, and thank you very much, all of you, right, for joining Ruby and joining me today during my office hours. And I look forward to seeing you again. In the meantime, happy cooking. Bye-bye.